So at this point, I'm going to introduce Daniel Schlozman, who is here. Daniel received his PhD in government and social policy from Harvard University and is currently an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University, where he teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses in political science. He is the author of When Movement Anchor Parties, subtitled Electoral Alignments in American History. I want to make sure I got those words right. When movement anchor parties. When movements, that's the problem. Okay, thank you. When movements anchor parties, electoral alignments in American history. It provides a bold new interpretation of American electoral history by examining 5 prominent movements and their relationships with political parties from the Civil War through the Republican Party of the 1970s. As I learned last night in conversation with Daniel, he is a sometime fellow resident of these Chilmark Hills, and we are fortunate to have him with us at this point to lead this discussion with John Judis.
And it is now my pleasure to introduce John Judis. John Judis is the editor-at-large at Talking Points Memo, a former senior writer at National Journal, and a former senior national editor at The New Republic. He has written for the New York Times Magazine, The Washington Post, and Mother Jones. John is the author of numerous books, including William F. Buckley, Jr., Patron Saint of the Conservatives, The Folly of Empire, What George W. Bush Could Learn from Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and Genesis, Truman, American Jews, and the Origins of the Arab-Israeli Conflict. Most recently, he has written a trilogy of short books, The Populist Explosion, The Nationalist Revival, and The Socialist Awakening. His new book, from Columbia Global Reports, The Politics of Our Time, Populism, Nationalism, Socialism, revises and updates each of these 3 books. The book serves as a guide to understanding the roots of the ideologies shaping discontent among parties and politicians in the United States and in Europe, on the right and on the left. So, welcome. And before we delve into populism, nationalism, socialism, we have plenty to talk about. Talk a little bit about where you've been and how you got to writing this book after having thought about and participated in American national politics for a good while now.
Okay, that's fine. And thank you for coming to this. I was worried as I saw people straggling in. I gave a book talk about the emerging Democratic majority at Borders. I think that was the book. During the sniper crisis of the early 2000s. And there were about 4 salespeople at Borders, and that was more people than attended the actual talk. So I'm grateful that you came to hear me. Let me just say a little bit about myself, and that'll be a way of introducing the argument of the books themselves. I'm I guess, 3rd generation. My grandparents were immigrants who became very wealthy. My parents inherited a lot of that money and a business. When I was about 12, they sold their business in Chicago and moved to Palm Beach, Florida, where they set up a little dress store. And within a year, they'd completely lost their shirt. And for the next decade, while I was growing up as a teenager, my family just was in total crisis. Alcoholism, attempted suicide, you name it. I mean, moving from place to place. While I was a scholarship student at a prep school and ended up going to a fancy New England college that I quit after 2 years. So I say that as a way of explaining to myself as well why I ended up as a democratic socialist, the kind of Bernie socialist, because I had as a child growing up a very bad experience with the free market capitalism. And I'm not saying that I'm a Marxist, all that stuff, but again, I think that's where my skepticism came from. I was a graduate student in philosophy at Berkeley for a while. In 1966 or so, I quit to become a professional revolutionary. I was an SDS We started a journal called, believe it or not, Socialist Revolution. We were socialists, which meant we were in favor of elections, but we wanted to add revolution so the people who thought of themselves at the time as revolutionary communists would take us seriously. That was June 1969. Within a year or two, it was a total anachronism. I mean, it was a ridiculous thing. But I was also a participant in the New American Movement, which was a precursor of the Democratic Socialists of America. By the early 70s, I began to grow disillusioned with the New Left and with my own politics. And I think the experience that really shook me was in early 1976, our organization was deciding whether to endorse Tom Hayden for Senate in the Democratic primary in California. I was in the Bay Area still. And we had a big argument. We had people who said, no, we shouldn't be in elections. We should have a third party. We should never support Democrats. And it came down finally to a presentation by one of our members. And this person, who later became a PR person for Richie Daley in Chicago 20 years later, framed her whole argument in terms of Lenin's state and revolution. V.I. Lenin, you know, Russia. And I was sitting there thinking about it, and I said to myself, my God, I'm just in a parallel universe here. I mean, what am I really doing? I mean, we're talking about Lenin. People wouldn't even, 99.9% of the people wouldn't understand. And it was at that point that I really left the organized socialist left and became a journalist. And for me, what being a journalist meant was, I always say that I'm a scientific socialist, and the emphasis on science, which is that I want to know what's really happening in the world and what people think. And that includes people who I disagree with. And, my method is, a lot of people rely on polls. I try to think into people's shoes. What would I think if I were, living in a small town in the Midwest that had been decimated and that I could no longer look forward to lifetime employment for myself and my kids? How would I think? And then you go ask and you see if your assumptions are wrong. But that's been my method as a journalist. The last thing I'd say about my experience on the New Left was that I was really part of its destruction. I'm not saying I was responsible for it, but I was there from 68 to 75 when it just went to nowhere, when a movement, SDS had 100,000 plus chapters, and it went to, a handful of terrorists. I'm sorry to put it that way, but, and nuts. And how did that happen? Well, a lot of it was involved with identity politics and ideas like white skin privilege, the division of America into whites versus blacks, everybody, there was brown power, yellow power, black power. Out of that experience, and I think Bernie Sanders drew the same kind of lesson. We're exactly the same age, Bernie and I, and he went to Vermont and I went to Berkeley. Is the idea that if we want to get anything done in America, we have to build political majorities. And what that involves is drawing in people that don't necessarily think like us. And if a division is going to be on culture, if it's going to be on race rather than class, then we're going to be in trouble. And the people exactly that we want to help are going to get screwed, which is exactly what happened after the New Left. We had the Reagan Revolution, 20 years of the decimation of the New Deal, the war on poverty, all that stuff. So again, that's the lesson that I bring today. And if there's a message in my books, it's one, try to think through how other people you disagree with think, including the Trump people. I think that's why the populist explosion, the first of these, was popular, was because it did try to explain Trump rather than just dismiss him and dismiss the people who voted for him. And second, beware of extremes on your own side. Beware of replicating the old Puritan immigration to America from the 17th century in terms of a kind of moral absolutism. So I think those are the lessons from my past.
So you're beginning to answer the question of why you are thinking about political ideology, but now that we're getting into the nuts and bolts of these books, what are populism, nationalism, and socialism, and how do they relate to one another? So,
well, the main ones really are populism and nationalism that I really need to talk about. Populism appears on both the left and the right. In Europe, they think of it almost entirely as a right-wing phenomenon. Mussolini, Hitler. In the United States, we had a populist movement in the 1890s, and really that's where the name populism came from, is the United States. I mean, there were similar things happening in France, but that was the basis. And it was on the left. It wasn't on the right. 1930s, Huey Long, again, more on the left than the right. So it's appeared in both ways. So populism isn't itself a kind of ideology like liberalism or conservatism. It's a framework of thinking. It's a logic. It's a grammar. And what it does is it separates out the elite from the people. And it foresees a conflict between the people and the elite or establishment. Now, the difference between the left-wing and the right-wing varieties of populism is that with the left, it's pretty much the people versus the elite. It's a two-term relationship. It's Occupy Wall Street, the 99% versus the 1%. Bernie, the billionaire class. What did Elizabeth Warren call them? The rich and famous, or whatever. She had her own term for it. With the right, with the populist right, there is the same kind of divisions and often the same kind of politics. I mean, again, Sanders and Trump in 2016, trade, multinational corporations, very similar kinds of complaints about elites taking advantage economically of working people. But there's usually a third term, and that's the idea that the elites are coddling this outgroup. And the outgroups can be illegal aliens, they can be Muslims, they can be African Americans. You always find that third element. And, again, that's what makes populism on the right toxic. And it leads to the kind of, bigotry and xenophobia that you find with Trump. But again, the framework is very similar. And in 2016, I don't think this happened in 2020, when I was covering the election, you find a lot of Bernie Trump voters. I mean, beginning in New Hampshire. Well, I'm deciding between those two guys because there was an underlying logical similarity. Nationalism. I had the populism book was very popular. I mean, I think it sold more copies than all the other books I'd written for the last 15 years combined. Well, maybe not the emerging democratic revolution. The nationalism book, a lot of people on the left wouldn't touch. They saw it as toxic, and they saw the subject as toxic. And I think that that's a great mistake. In order to have a democracy, in order to have an advanced welfare state, you have to have a notion that you're part of this common thing called a nation. So that if I'm paying taxes, and those taxes are going to support some crippled person, I can use this term because I have a cane these days, so don't give me a hard time. In Reno, Nevada, that I'm never going to see, that I don't know what color they are or anything, I have to be willing to have that money go to that person. And the reason I would be willing to do it is that that person's also an American. If I think the money's going to fly overseas anywhere, it's not going to work. Democracy itself, voting, depends again on this idea that you're part of a common nation. That you are going to be willing to accept what the majority says. And, again, this was what was so subversive about the Trump stuff, especially after the last election. because what he did and where nationalism can go is not in this kind of common sense, patriotic way, but in a way that justifies a kind of exclusionary politics, where only certain people are really part of the nation and other people don't qualify. You know, I always thought that Trump was going to turn out, you know, maybe okay, that he would sand off the rough edges once he became president, and not you know, with the Mexican judge and the rapists and all that stuff. You know, he would get rid of that and act presidential, which, you know, all our presidents have done, even the ones, you know, that you dislike the most. He didn't, and one of the first signs was when he started talking about the reason Hillary Clinton won, got a bigger popular vote was what, 5 million illegal immigrants voted. You know, that was a sign again that we were in deep trouble with this guy and with this administration. So again, in terms of populism and nationalism, what I'd suggest to you again is that it is very important that we are Americans and that we think that way and that we evaluate whether politics are in the national interest. And, you know, again, I mean, the other aspect is that for many people in America, especially people who lived in towns that have been decimated by deindustrialization, nation, God, family, these things are very important in a way that somebody who lives in whatever, Martha's Vineyard or Washington, D.C., and thinks about themselves as an alumnus of XY College, of, you know, a member of the yacht club, the, you know, God knows what other identities, a big law firm. For a lot of people, nation is much more important and central to their lives. And so, you know, you have to understand when Colin Kaepernick did this stuff about kneeling, that's going to offend a lot of people. I'm not saying he should or shouldn't do it, but you have to understand why. And it's not just because these people are damn fools. So, again, I think that's the message. You want me to talk a little about socialism?
Yeah, let's get everything out.
Okay. So,
big table.
Danny has an easy job here. I just yakety yak. Socialism, if you talk to Bernie's supporters, if you interview them, or if you interview me, it's no longer the socialism of the 60s, and it's no longer the socialism of Eugene Debs and the Socialist Party or of the Communist Party. It is Scandinavia. It's cooperation among people. It's racial and sexual equality. It's an idea where there'd be some kind of real shift in power in America from the very wealthy and powerful to those who are less powerful. Medicare for all, some way in which people who can't afford an education can go to school. Again, something similar to, let's say, a Scandinavian country, but in America, that's very radical, as we've seen. I mean, you're talking heavy radicalism. And that's what the kids think of as socialism. And I think that is theoretically, too, a viable idea. Because the old Marxist Hegelian idea that there would be a stage called capitalism, then it would be punctuated by this huge revolution where everybody would shoot at each other, and then you'd get something socialism where the market, the money, and everything would disappear, is basically a historical fallacy, and we've seen that. And what we're seeing instead is something very similar to happen in the transition from feudalism to capitalism, where elements of socialism are growing within capitalism itself. And, you know, that's what a lot of the New Deal was about. And that's what, you know, Biden and a lot of this recovery and relief stuff is about. It's not about ending markets, but it is about creating these new islands of security and of workers' power, again, the PRO Act, within capitalism itself. And, you know, maybe we'll see a time when the balance really shifts in a dramatic way. But I don't think we're going to see the kind of Armageddon where, you know, a lot of people on the left really thought about in 1969, where there would be a clash of thunder and boom, you know, off would go capitalism and we'd get socialism. So that's my view of socialism.
How did we get here? There are two narratives that are dueling in these books, and I want you to compare and contrast them. The first is that the key actors in both cases are elites. In one case, the story is mostly about cultural elites. These are cosmopolitans. You were gesturing to this earlier. And what's important are their transnational loyalties. These are what, quoting David Goodhart, you call anywheres rather than somewheres, what the late Andrew Greeley called neighborhood people who are rooted in local communities, in place, traditional identities, strong sense of nationhood. And the problem in this cultural story is that the anywheres are arrogant, and their arrogance, in the end, doomed their project, and the people rallied to Donald Trump, as in other places, and we'll get to the comparative dimension here. They have rallied to those who are giving them a much more thick and traditional story. The second is a much more hard economic story, and that is that what, for lack of a better term, we will call neoliberalism, and we will hopefully not discuss exactly what neoliberalism is, and that is that set of economic processes, free trade deals, the entrance of China into the global economy, deregulation, deunionization, means that the economy of the New Deal order falls apart, and into the void come actors who say that they're going to turn the clock back to a better time. And for the first, these elites are much more coming, and these bundled together, from the broad left, the center left, in the latter, from the broad center right. In the first, we have a story where politics is about ideas. In the second, it's much more strictly interests. And even if someone like Robert Rubin can have all of these contradictions in his person, I want to talk a little bit more about how the neoliberalism economic story and the somewheres, anywheres story fit together.
Good. I get asked this question a lot, but in different ways, and it's basically what's the relationship between economics and culture. And I think a lot of people on both the left and the right think it's all about culture. My view, I won't say it's strictly Marxist. It's influenced by my other mentor, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who talked about forms of life. I talk about ways of life. And what we had happening in the last 30 years or 40 years in America is really the destruction of this whole ideological order that was based on the promise that if we had free markets, if we deregulated finance, if we had borders that were relatively open, where we had, degree of immigration that we've never had, we hadn't had since before 1924. If we had an international system that China and Russia could participate in, we'd have this kind of utopian order. In the European Union, you have the same kind of illusions, that if you had a common currency, then Spain and Italy would begin to become as prosperous as Germany or the Netherlands. So we had this kind of period in the 90s of tremendous utopian illusions. It's the Clinton period. It's the period of the internet boom. And you know why it happened. The world is flat, Thomas Friedman, all this stuff. And that really comes crashing down during the Great Recession. In Europe, even before that, it becomes crashing down by the kind of fusion of immigration and terrorism, where you get a sudden fear of immigrants is fused with the threat of Islamic terrorism. So again, open borders, free trade, all this suddenly comes a cropper. And the term that Danny used, neoliberalism, I mean, that's very common. The casualties in the United States or in Europe were in these areas that are called the left behinds. They're the small and mid-sized towns that depended upon mining, depended upon manufacturing, where a lot of the businesses either go overseas or go out of business because they can't compete with China and with other low-wage producers. So in those kind of areas, what you get is a lot of the kids leave, incidentally. They go from the furniture towns in North Carolina, they all move to Raleigh, Durham and stuff. I've had this experience with people when I've given this talk who owned a furniture company there that moved to Mexico. So they move. But what's left is a population that's predominantly older, predominantly more white, that, again, is left with this feeling of something has been really lost in America. And Trump's appeal, Make America Great Again, spoke to them. So for again, that group, it's a combination of an economic foundation shifting from under them and a threat seen to their own, what was their own culture. A culture of neighborhood bars, of union halls, you name it. They devolve upon my home, which I protect with guns, my family, my nation, and that becomes the central preoccupation. Whereas for a lot of Americans who move to these great metro centers, it shifts, and we become more prosperous and assume more identities. And that's where the term anywheres from David Goodhart, a British sociologist, used this term. Again, people who have multiple identities and who don't rely on these kind of verities. And again, I think there's a relationship there between the economy and how the economy changes between the concentration of wealth. What was it, 70% or something of the Biden vote was accounted for 70% of the GDP. Enormous differences. That's where American prosperity's been, and a lot of places like West Virginia left behind vote for Trump because he seems to speak again to their sense of loss, to their sense of America was once great and now what's happened to it. The way I see Trump and the way I also see a lot of the European populists is a kind of early warning signal that something's really wrong with the assumptions that have reigned over our economy. The relationship between government and the economy, trade, immigration. Trump brought a kind of odd man in the street view. For many years after the Cold War ended, if you asked the ordinary person, or even somebody like myself who's not so ordinary, I don't know, what's the point of NATO now that the Cold War's over? They would scratch their head and they say, I don't know. Now, in the Beltway, near where I live in Washington, D.C., they would be figuring out, well, we should do X and Y. We should go include Georgia in NATO. Should we or should we not? But the point of it somehow is lost. So Trump comes along and says, what's the point of this? China, we are getting screwed by them. He comes along, there's a problem there. Immigration, Southwest, South, Los Angeles, jobs competition. Again, what the economists will tell you is that on the average, wages are up. That's true, but a lot of people on the lower end are getting screwed, including blacks with a high school education who had to compete for low-level service sector jobs with immigrants. Again, Trump, again, bigoted. I'm not defending the way he put it, but there's a problem here. So again, in terms of understanding Trump, in terms of our history, I don't know where we're going to end up, but we should understand his politics and his appeal, not just as, it's all these ignorant racist bastards who are, have always been there all along getting their way, but again, as a warning signal that our prevailing assumptions, that there's something wrong with them, and we really have to shift our views of, say, the relationship of government to the economy, what we emphasize, whether we emphasize finance or industry in our economic programs. So that's That's a long-winded answer to your question.
To be clear, on the relationship, sorry to be a little political sciencey for all of you, on the relationship between income and voting, in any given place, there is a positive relationship, not as positive as it was a couple decades ago, but still positive, between family income and voting Republican. In Chilmark, in West Virginia, in the Bronx, the higher your income, the more likely you are to vote for Republicans. What has changed is there's now a substantial negative relationship between the overall income of a place and the overall share of residents who vote Republican. So that poorer places, and in particular less dense places, density, this is the urban-rural story, density is a very good predictor of voting for center-right parties, right parties. That is true in the United States, and it's true in the countries in Europe that you talk about. All right.
So, you know, when Rui Teixeira and I wrote the Emerging Democratic Majority, I mean, we had these great pictures in our book. And if you go back to 1960, the Democratic-Republican vote looked like a pyramid, both in income and education. You know, the lower the income, the lower the education, the more Democratic, and up you go. You know, that's really changed. Yeah. And the Democratic coalition has become, you know, both coalitions become very unwieldy. And the Democratic coalition, I mean, you know, again, in Georgia, a lot of the big shift were those suburbs outside of Atlanta. It wasn't inside Atlanta. It was the upscale suburbs outside. And if you look in other places, if you look in Wisconsin, why did Biden win? The collar suburbs around Milwaukee, they are still Republican, but they shifted. Right. So I think a lot of that is on the basis of cultural issues. And, you know, I've been looking for a while for whether there was going to be a shift in the Latino vote and whether Latinos were going to follow the path of the Irish, Italians, and other immigrants. And, you know, as they get wealthier, they start to become more conservative economically, more conservative maybe socially. And, yeah, again, I think we're starting to see that. And there isn't a kind of magic majority formula by which the Democrats are going to carry votes. So, yeah, there's been this tremendous change. And a lot of that, again, is the result of this weird kind of demarcation or bifurcation that's been created in the American economy after the last 30 or 40 years between, again, small town, midtown, less prosperous America, and these huge metro centers.
Yeah. That on income and education. In 1960, Republicans did best among voters who were high income and high education. Democrats did best among voters who were low income and low education. Now we have an unusual situation in which Democrats do best among voters who are high income and low education. These are people with master's degrees and not great earnings. Republicans do best among folks who are low education, high income, car dealers, people in the trades. All right, so before we get to questions, which we should do, I want to push you on left nationalism because I think that's what we should do. That there's an argument in this book to not just that, and one sees this fair amount, liberals should talk more about patriotism, God and country, but actually reduce legal immigration. And the question then is, why should we, and two questions. First, is it a normative matter? Why should we exclude people so they don't exclude them? And the second is, demographically, why is it that if you have some interest in gaining majority, that you think that the prospect of gaining a majority is better doing that than leaving on the table the votes of the sort of well-educated, rainbow, the people you were talking about in the emerging Democratic majority as the future of the party. Is this actually a good bet that you can't go home again to the new sort of...
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
What's the question?
The question is, why left nationalism, why is this a good idea both normatively, and why is this a good idea as far as coalition politics, that this isn't just trying to recreate a New Deal coalition that can't exist anymore?
Well, look,
So,
as far as
two
the
are
question
linked.
of nationalism and patriotism, I draw a very sharp distinction here. The people who are really offended by the idea of being an American or of nationalism represent a very, very small minority in America. I mean, I sometimes term them, if it doesn't offend anybody, as, well, when I lived in California, we used to talk about Greater Berkeley as the, which, it's the same joke. So I talk about Greater Brooklyn, or you could talk about Greater Oberlin or something like that. It's a small group. I live in the Montgomery County in the suburbs. Upscale suburbs, but I know the surroundings too, Prince George, which is not as upscale. A lot of the politics of that are characterized by the left, and that you'd find in some of the publications, New York Times, New Yorker, etc., don't ring a bell for a lot of these suburbanites. For a lot of the people. So I think that the politics I'm talking about nationalism, I think it would makes a lot of sense to many Americans. And the people who were so upset by it really do constitute a very small minority. Unfortunately, they also have a lot of influence in the culture. You see now, these amazing kind of polls. When Trump, there's a guy that you would expect could not possibly win Hispanic votes. But, he did very well, and he did well in the border communities. And you could say, well, that's because a lot of people worked as guards or on the wall. But it's also true that the Hispanic community that votes has no more different view of illegal immigration. We're not talking about the size of immigration or anything like that than other people. They're also wary of having no border security. And the Democrats, for some reason, have just been blind to this issue. I mean, I am entirely for incorporating the 11 million people who are undocumented into our country. We should not have this kind of, which you used to call a lumpen proletariat, people who are powerless, who employers can take advantage of. Who also consume emergency rooms and things like that. Well, they should become citizens. There should be a path to citizenship. But we should also do something about our borders. If you want to change the law and have no borders, that's fine. But we're supposed to have borders, and we should do something about it. And Democrats should be serious about it. And there's ways to do it. E-Verify, for instance, which the AFL-CIO used to support, where employers have to verify at the risk of severe punishment whether the people actually have green cards.
Okay.
So there are ways to do it.
The time signal. So do we have time for a question, or okay?
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Setting the time signal
Okay.
only because it's probably time. to ask
Okay.
people.
Okay. Yes.
And there are microphones there.
Great.
And there. Please speak into the microphones and try to keep your questions brief.
And they should end with question marks.
We have about 10 minutes.
Great.
Okay, very short question. Could
Good.
you talk about voting? Because you're all presuming that everyone's going to be able to vote, but based upon your work and research and what's going on with regard to voting rights, I'd just be curious to hear what you have to say.
Oh boy, well, there is an attempt right now among the sort of the Stop the Steal Republicans to suppress voting. A lot of it is what you might even call nostalgic. It's a lot of the things they're passing are making it impossible to do what we did during the pandemic, but which we ordinarily are not going to do, which is, vote 4 weeks in advance or whatever, do a lot of mail-in voting. So, it's not. I worry about about ballot access, making it hard for people especially in cities, to get to polling places. I worry about these attempts to give state legislators a lot of power over who the electors are. But I kind of think that even this Supreme Court would throw that kind of thing out. I doubt whether it would pass much. So yeah, it's a big deal. But again, so is the gerrymandering and the fact that Republicans control so many of the state legislators. The number
ways
of
that the Senate is, if in a country where rural voters are overrepresented in the Senate and rural voters are not representative of the country, rural voters and disproportionately in small states are not representative of the country as a whole, you have a world in which it's very, very difficult for the composition of the Senate to mirror the partisan composition of the American people. And the way to solve that is to add some new states.
So anyway,
the Senate.
That's I see all those as problematic for 2022. As far as the legislation that's been proposed, the House bill H.R. 1 was like a Christmas tree. There was just too much stuff on it. And they have to narrow it down. And even if they don't pass it, it has to be something that people can understand and that they can rally around and say the Republicans don't want Election Day to be a holiday, or they don't want elections to take place on a Sunday. Not that, Republicans don't want people to pay taxes to support elections, which is still not that popular an issue. So, yeah, I'm hoping that the Democrats can narrow the issue so that either they get something, or if they don't get it, the Republicans get blamed.
Over here.
Sure. As you know, Tucker Carlson has been in Budapest this past week speaking to Viktor Orban. This is a country where I lived for 19 years, so I know that system very well. And there are so many parallels to what you have described here, and I'm wondering how you feel about this as a mirror to our democracy.
Oh, I went to Hungary, and I spent a few weeks there when I was writing the book on nationalism, and there's a chapter about Hungary and Poland in there. And for a Jew like myself, it was very scary because you go there, and this was a year ago, 2018 maybe, and it was just plastered with pictures of George Soros as the enemy. And, if you don't think that there's a kind of dog whistle there, you're crazy. So,
image to make him look even more Jewish.
Yeah, and so that's on one hand. On the other hand, he really has, in Hungary, I don't know whether you want to get into a discussion of Hungary, suppressed the press. And he's done it in very, I said after going there that if Trump were as good a politician as Viktor Orban, we'd really be in trouble. I mean, he got his cronies to buy up newspapers and TV stations. So it's not like the government took them over. They didn't have to. And so then the EU funds were used again to support the same people. So there was a kind of revolving crony capitalism, the result of which is there's virtually no independent journalism in Hungary. So I'll say that's one thing. Now, in both Hungary and Poland, what you find that's really odd is that in the wake of the end of communism in those countries, the liberal parties were kind of free market neoliberal parties. And the parties like Orban's or Law and Justice in Poland are the parties that really do express much more concern about things like what we would call Social Security, health care for everybody. Orban and Law and Justice both have these family allowances that are extremely popular in rural and small town areas in Hungary and Poland. So whereas the opposition is sort of like, I don't know, they're like free market Republicans. They're not the nasty people. We're not talking Trump, but we're talking at best like my governor, Larry Hogan, or somebody like that. They're not left wing in any sense. I mean, Milton Friedman really replaced Karl Marx to a great extent. So, again, I don't think we're near anything like happened in Hungary, and it's just another one of these fads with these people. I got invited by one of the Danube Institute, to come speak, and luckily I could just say because of the pandemic I didn't want to do it, but they are trying their best in Hungary to promote themselves as a model.
Thank you.
You use the term identity politics. How big a threat, if a threat at all, do you see identity politics to the future of Democrats getting elected in the next couple elections?
I'm one of those people who, when the demonstrations started over George Floyd, after the first few days and when the looting began, it started to raise all kinds of red flags for me, and I really started to get worried. And what happened in places like Seattle, Portland, the idea of defund the police, which, believe me, is just, in my county, Montgomery County, I'm sorry, it's just people don't understand stuff like that. There is police brutality, and we should prosecute it, but defund the police. So, again, I worry about that. I worry about, again, the kind of exaggerated, the right is making this whole thing about critical race theory and the 1619 Project. And, as an intellectual, I find some merit in that, but in general, I don't agree with some of those things. But, again, the problem for Democrats, again, is if politics gets framed as white versus black. And it's especially a problem because we don't have a country that's white and black anymore. Since 1965, had this huge influx of immigrants, Asians, Hispanics, Africans, and we're a very different country. And if we get trapped into this white-black stuff as Democrats, I'm not saying we shouldn't deal with the issues, we're going to be in big trouble. And I see that as one of the dangers looming in 2022 and 2024.
I think we are at time, so thank you all very much. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.